This episode, I want to try something new. We see statistics that show how many people listen to this podcast, but it doesn't show us who our listeners are. I'm curious about who listens to this podcast, and I think some of you might be interested in what kind of community of listeners you're a part of. If you'd like to share a little bit about where you are on your journey, how you found this podcast, and what you are looking for, you can click a link in the show notes and I'll read your submission on the podcast. No need to share any identifying information, and the information you do share will not be used for any other purpose. Thanks. Welcome to the Jungian Anthology podcast by the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Why a Conscious Life Has a Positive End, an interview with Dan Ross. In this episode, Patricia Martin interviews Jungian analyst Dan Ross about conscious individuation throughout life stages and why it makes for a better death. Daniel Ross, RN, PMHNP, MSN, MBA, has been a nurse for 40 years. He has worked extensively as Director of Clinical Services in the field of home health care and hospice. As a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, he brings both a medical and psychiatric experience to his work. He currently works part-time in the field of palliative care and hospice as a nurse practitioner, visiting patients in their home or nursing facility, helping them in their transition to hospice. He is also a Jungian analyst in private practice in downtown Chicago. Patricia Martin is a noted cultural analyst, author, and consultant, and a producer on this podcast. For a more complete bio, just check the show notes. You can support this podcast by making a donation to the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago, purchasing something in our online store, coming to any of our online programs, our training programs, or just submitting a review on iTunes. Reviews help people find this podcast and help us find new listeners. Thanks. And now here's the interview.
Welcome to Jungian Anthology. This is Patricia Martin. I'm a researcher, author, and professional affiliate of the C.G. Jung Institute Chicago. Today, I'm going to be talking with Dan Ross. Dan is a Jungian analyst who co-teaches a 6-month course that is an immersion into Carl Jung's biography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections at the C.G. Jung Institute Chicago. Dan has been a nurse working in hospice for over 30 years. As a psychiatric mental health practitioner, he brings both a medical and psychiatric experience to the field of end-of-life care. Dan also maintains a private practice in the Chicago area. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Patricia.
So as I was looking over the many topics that you cover in your course about Jung's life and his ideas, there were so many important themes that jumped out. But I think the one that really stood out to me for today's conversation was Jung's journey into the realm of the unconscious. And I know that there was, when he was a young pioneer, sort of a mentee of Sigmund Freud's, they had a famous disagreement about the idea of the unconscious. Can you explain why that was such a deal breaker for the two of them and why it kind of forced a schism?
Yeah, I think to try to put it simply, and it's much more complicated than this, but Freud saw the unconscious as a consequence of the ego that was unacceptable or impossible for the ego to grasp or hold on to or tolerate gets cast into the unconscious, usually around sexual wishes that there are that cause a conflict within the individual, an immense conflict. And Jung, although he celebrated Freud's discoveries of the unconscious, from very early on, Jung saw, and it took him a while to be able to grasp or articulate this, but that the ego actually comes from the unconscious, and the unconscious was there long before the ego, and the unconscious as collective is kind of a history of mankind and all that mankind has experienced, and that was simply very difficult for Freud to accept, and impossible. Freud's notorious rigidity around his theories and his practice of psychoanalysis, and Jung was very open and to what he was experiencing empirically, what he was experiencing in his practice, very open to all kinds of things, including occultism, which he had a relationship to from early childhood. And Freud was absolutely against occultism and told Jung that. At one point, he told Jung that we have to, whatever you do, hold on to the sexual theory, so that we can, because it's a bulwark. And Jung asked him, a bulwark against what? And Freud said, a bulwark against the black tide of occultism, or something like that. I'm not sure I'm quoting that exactly, but and Jung knew right then and there that he ultimately would not be able to stay with Freud's more rigid approach to the unconscious. And that manifested in the Psychology of the Unconscious when it was published in 1913. And that was too much for Freud. It was over at that point.
I see. So why is the unconscious so critical to understanding ourselves?
Well, that's a good question, because it is so much of ourselves. It is so much more of ourselves than we grasp when we're young. When we're young, we think that ego is everything. That what we think, how we deliberate, how we make decisions, that's all coming from. When we're young, we think it's coming from, well, the only place it could come from. But if we allow ourselves what we use the term relativize the ego in terms of something bigger than us, then we see that our life has been informed by something that we were not aware of and get glimpses of over time. And if we study it, that as Jung did, we can develop a whole different relationship to everything that is not I, not us. Jung had this dream. I forget how old he was, but he was still young. I think in his teens, late teens, and the dream, I think, really put him on a particular path. And it was a dream in which he was surrounded by darkness, and he was carrying a small light, and he realized, and that he sensed that something very large was coming up behind him, something large and black, and he realized that this small light he was holding was all he had of consciousness, all of what he knew. And that what was much bigger in contrast to that, what was following him, and that he called the shadow, and that the shadow actually carried his number two personality. So he started, this idea of number one, number two personality that he grew up with in childhood and was able to discern. He was now developing some conceptualization around, and he attributed all of this black thing as shadow and this little light as consciousness. And that this was something he was going to be in relationship to the rest of his life.
So this is a beautiful image that you can derive from this dream, is that this little light is surrounded by a much larger mass.
Yes.
And that much larger mass really kind of, that's the container for all that is unconscious to
everything.
us, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So the dream thing is important in so many ways, I think, right? This is another big realm for Jungian analysis, is dream work. Mm-hmm. And because I'm a writer, I keep a daily journal. And writers believe that, if you write every day, it sort of opens the channel to connect to your creativity.
Sure.
It doesn't matter what you write about, as long as you're just writing every day. And I wondered if Jungians keep a daily journal of their dreams. And if they do, what comes of that? What do your patients or your analysans tend to derive if they keep a daily dream journal?
And not all do, but those that do, I think it's a sign very often that they've made a switch. They've made a switch from a more psychotherapeutic relationship to a more analytic relationship, because when you're keeping a journal, you're having a relationship with and a conversation with, dialogue with yourself or some aspect of yourself. And you're realizing often that there are different parts of you, and the dreams reflect these different parts of you, or can reflect these different parts of you, and that having a relationship to the unconscious and these different personalities perhaps within us, and treating them as such really can change how your attitude towards the unconscious and how you get along in life from day to day. It's a remarkable thing. And not all my patients reach or move to that stage. Some of them reach a state in which their symptoms may have subsided or mitigated, and that may be enough for them. Or they may come back later, back into therapy with a different attitude, having matured after that. But there is something about journaling that I notice with some of my patients, that they've reached a stage, a different stage. Yes.
So you could say that it's sort of a marker of their individuation, which is another big idea of Carl Jung's, is this idea of how we grow into being a more whole and integrated person.
Right.
Meaning that we have accessed our unconscious and we're sort of knitting this all together.
Yes, absolutely.
Is
I
that
like
how
that
you
image.
Is that how you would define individuation? I mean, how do you talk about it?
Boy, individuation is such a big thing. The weaving together of parts of ourselves is an image. This idea in mythology of dismemberment, that one goes through a process of dismemberment and has to remember aspects of ourselves. We can't seem to escape childhood without having cast off important parts of our personality simply because they were not acceptable to our parents or the uh, the, uh, the people that we grew up with, or the culture, or society. And so adulthood is best involves this recollecting of ourselves, I think. But there's so many different ways of looking at individuation too, because in my work with death and dying, I've discovered that all our life is a movement towards really embracing and owning and feeling our own mortality, our own limitedness. And that's a very, very important part of individuation. It's a matter of becoming more embodied and more present. And I noticed working with people at the end of life, a difference between those that had done that work or had moved through life in a more embodied way. That the end of their life is not as difficult, is not as violent, is not as disturbed. And I noticed over the years working in hospice that there's a contrast between how people end their lives. And that I think has a great deal to do with how they've lived their lives.
Say more about this idea of how one faces the end of life if one has done the work of consciously building a relationship with their unconscious, or consciously individuating, which means, you know, you're seeking experiences and you're seeking an inner sense of yourself.
Yeah.
Versus someone who hasn't done that work.
Yeah.
Can you be more specific?
Yeah, I think I can tell if I meet somebody that's lived a very egocentric life and very driven life, and tyrannical in a sense, meaning that they've been led by some inner tyrant that has pushed them and pushed them and pushed them. That often the end of life becomes very difficult because they haven't reconciled anything of their past, because they were always looking towards the future. Part of individuation is reconciling your past, or coming to terms with your past, your regrets, the paths you didn't take in life, and mourning the missed opportunities in your life. Mourning becomes very important late in life. And if you've avoided that, that mourning comes back with a vengeance, it seems, and that manifests often with very, very severe symptoms in some people. And I'm talking about a fraction of people that I've worked with, not a large number. For the most part, I find that people are approach their end of their life quite prepared.
That's interesting. I wondered about that because, you know, when you were talking about the interest that Jung cultivated his entire career in occultism and other ways, astrology and the tarot and other ways to kind of trigger material that might arise from his unconscious, he also became a darling. His theories became a darling of the New Age. And I think the New Age was actually a phrase he coined.
Yes.
And so I wonder, as boomers immerse themselves in the New Age and really sort of embraced it, and, you know, true Jungians believe that this was a sort of misuse of Jungian theory. But be that as it may, there was an entire generation that is now coming of age and facing the end of life.
Yeah.
And I wonder how that New Age mysticism has prepared people or not prepared people to face the end of life.
That's a good question. I think the end of life for me, the way I describe it now is opens up liminal space. And how one has dealt with liminal psychological space through their life, I think has informs how they do so at the end of life. I mean, once we're told there's nothing more that can be done, often patients referred to hospice or palliative care. There's this idea that the person is now cast into this, the space. This, okay, the medical model is no longer able to keep me alive. There's nothing more they can do, and I'm on my own. There's a sense of now I'm on my own. Now, for some, it's a terrifying experience. I often meet with people when first referred to palliative care, very, very anxious about this new position that they're in their life, and a lot of it has to do with developing a relationship of trust, and then understanding what's emerging at this time. And I've just experienced all kinds of amazing things that once the heroic attitude, what I call the heroic attitude, which is the attitude of I'm going to do everything, to stay alive. Once that shifts, then it opens up consciousness to finishing, what I call finishing one's life. And that may include rituals of some kind, that may include giving things away, that might include forming your memorial service. It may include having last conversations with people. It opens up people to finishing the relationship to life, and in my experience, that is very rewarding to people, and to the family members, to people around them, to clinicians that work with them, and it's a wonderful thing to see. But I think it comes from the fact that that stage, even if culturally we don't identify it as such, is a sacred space that provides for growth and opportunity that may have not been available prior to this stage of life.
Well, as I think about that, I also wonder about this idea of loss that family members feel.
Yes.
And I know you counsel families,
yes,
as well as, the person who's facing the end of life.
Yes.
And people often talk about the pain of that. And Jung has a quote in his biography where he says, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. And that pain and loss are part of what helps us individuate. So, I mean, that's not exactly a selling point, pain. In our culture, we want to be pain-free. We pay to have that done, right?
Absolutely.
So is becoming more conscious necessarily painful?
I think so, but the pain is the pain the pain just seems to go along with movement, psychological movement, because we're moving out of old structures that we depended on and are familiar with into new structures that we're not familiar with. And that's scary and painful because we have to give up parts of ourselves. I think describing the pain is hard. In my experience with working with people, there's the resistance to the movement, I think, is a measure of fear that once they confront it, or once they experience it, or once they mourn the loss of that which they are losing, it was not as bad as they anticipated. In other words, they survive it,
Mm-hmm.
and in my experience, most people do and can. But they need, I guess, they need the hope that they can, and they need to eventually own that hope. Whereas the clinician generally holds it for a time being until the patient can hold it.
Oh, so this idea of hope, I mean, I also wonder if because Jung sort of rejected formal religion, and that was a big deal in his life because of his family and their ties to formal religion. But he embraced an option, you know, he embraced a sense of the soul as being a part of the psyche, of being accessible through ritual and access to the unconscious. I wonder if you could talk about Jung and how he is hopeful. Like, where do you find moments of true hope in what Carl Jung writes about and thought about?
It's a good question. First of all, I would clarify, I think Jung was very religious. And I think religion became extremely important to him because, as you said, because of his background. But it became important to him to not simply believe. There's a BBC interview that the interviewer asked him if he believed in God. And he really stopped and paused and said, quite honestly, that he struggled with that word belief. And then he said, I know. And I think Jung struggled with his father, who struggled with his belief, was in conflict because of the belief and the teachings of the Methodist Church and the dogma that he was caught up in. Jung experienced his father's struggle with that, and part of his work was to arrive at a place where he knew that the unconscious had, first of all, we have a religious function. The psyche has a religious function, so it's drawn towards religion and spirituality. I think that became one of the components of individuation too, that it was a relationship to spirituality, included a relationship to spirituality. That his whole, if you look at his whole conceptualization of the psyche, that it is moving towards wholeness, but that there's something guiding that he called the self, and that the self is a part of the whole. The unus mundus, as he borrowed the Latin term from alchemy, is that we came from a whole, and we live this life, and then we go back to the whole, but we're always part of that whole. So I think Jung experienced the world and life as very, very hopeful. I think he's very hopeful. Now, he's had critics around that his theories ignored or didn't quite address the experience that patients have around hopelessness. And one of the struggles I think clinicians have is not to bring their agenda of hope to a patient. That the patient is that is coming to the relationship with hopelessness and powerlessness needs the clinician to be able to understand that and not
So,
try to push an agenda.
so are you saying that then, I can imagine that many people turn to analysis because they're at a point in their lives where it does seem hopeless.
Mm-hmm.
And so are you saying then that each and every one of us is on their own journey toward hope? It's not somebody else's agenda, or it's not a quick fix. It's a journey toward hope.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Absolutely. Especially people that are coming from such a dark place of hopelessness.
So I wonder also, I was fascinated by your idea of reclaiming parts of ourselves. And it led me to want to ask you about the collective unconscious, in that, Jung believed that we have individual psyches, and then there's a collective where all of this material lives on a societal level.
Yes.
And I think about this week, we're on the verge of a new presidential inauguration, and many of us have watched by now the footage of the U.S. Capitol building under siege by other Americans. And I'm curious to know your thoughts on what might be going on in the collective unconscious. What does this say?
Yes, I think one of the things that is going on is that this mass thinking, this adoption of a truth that whatever side you're on, whatever political persuasion, whatever ideology, that the temptation, and Jung was always suspicious of groups and mass movements, because he felt that we can be taken over by demigods. We can be illusioned with a truth that's very tempting to take on, and then marshal all our energies in that direction, to believe something that on a mass scale, because it's easier. In other words, another way of looking at individuation, it's a movement out of the collective consciousness, and to begin thinking on your own. And the way that Jung describes we do that is to have a relationship to the collective unconscious, which was reflected in all of history, all of mythology, all of literature, because all of that reflects the objective psyche, as he called it. And if we have a relationship to that and realize that we are playing out a drama in any aspect of any time in our life, we are playing out a drama, that if we understand what is unconsciously affecting us in that drama, and that is driving us, and when we become conscious of that, we're no longer victimized by it. We're no longer a pawn or a puppet. And I think many people today, ironically, because we have all the available knowledge after Jung, analytical psychology and psychoanalysis, to break free of the collective attitudes. But yet, I think most people fall into this habit of taking on an ideology because it's easier. You're saying individuation is painful. Well, it's painful to break free of the collective. It's much more comforting to hold on to collective thoughts or ideas or mythology that develops. Or I won't use the word mythology. It's almost stories that seem to, now we have this mass communication with social media and such. It's much easier to glob onto that, to attach our identities to something larger, what we see as larger, rather than, like Jung, hold on to the light in his dream, hold on to that light, and build that light and grow that light against the blackness that's of the shadows. I think that's what I'm finding. And the greatest work that we can do in this particular time is the work of individuation, studying and analysis and therapy and trying to understand what is going on inside of us, trying to understand our nature. And our nature includes more than just what's immediately in front of us. Our nature includes this archaic connection to our humanity that goes all the way back to the birth of man.
So you talked about wanting people to understand now in this age of social media and groupthink, kind of wanting institutions to stand for some of the work that we have to just do as individuals. Institutions can't do that work for us.
Yes.
And so it makes me wonder, as you were developing this course, which is a sweeping look at, Jung's life and his theories, what was your driving motivation to do this?
It's a good question. I think I've always taught, and because I like a relationship to groups, and over many years I've gotten past the terror of going in front of people and talking, but I've also realized the opportunities in that is to learn a great deal, because it's a forum that's designed to provide a containment for people so that they can think and feel what they want. So it's a safe place, but also it's an intimate place where people can really talk about what they're thinking, what their fears are. And for our course, it's an attraction to Jung, and that the course is really designed as a mentorship to provide a safe place for people to continue their development of an understanding of Jung and his works, and to provide a structure for that. And I think ultimately, since we tied it to Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, his semi-autobiographical work, we're tying it to his life. So it's not just his concepts that we're explaining. It's in his own words, because many of his own essays, his works is being used for reading, but also tied it to his life and what was going on in his life at the various stages, because we designed the course as into stages of early, middle, and late years. And so we wanted to show this is what was going on with Jung at this time, because we certainly have very intimate details of his life that he provided us. Memories, Dreams, Reflections is very intimate, and he didn't even want it published in his lifetime. It was so intimate, such an intimate reflection of his life.
Well, I can't help but ask, as you lay out the three sections, beginning, middle, and end of his life, and because you've got this rare insight as a trained Jungian into end of life and how people face the end of life, how does that inform the way you look at the end of Jung's life? What was going on for him, and what lessons could we draw from that?
Wow. Yeah. What strikes me about what I know of the end of Jung's life was, and this is something that I experienced working with dying patients. There's just certain experiences that was not explainable in medicine and medical curricula or hospice curricula. The example is that somebody could be in a kind of a sedative state for long periods of time. As our body starts to shut down, we go through long periods of sleeping, for example, and sometimes that could go on for days, and then the body starts to dry up, meaning they take in less and less water, less and less food, and this body's going through this state where they're more someplace else than they are here, wherever they're at, right? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, and this is ubiquitous, it's not all the time, but it's so often that hospice staff talk about it, that a person will suddenly wake up. They'll be very lucid. They'll give instructions. They'll do certain things. They'll say certain things. And then all of a sudden, shortly after that, they go back into their sleep, and then they shortly die after that. There's this period of finishing. I call it finishing. That wherever they were, they come back for this last thing. Now, Jung did that. Jung was in a state of sleep for days before the end of his life. And the day he died, he suddenly woke up, asked his son to go down to the cellar to get a bottle of wine, and that they were going to have a last meal together with a glass of wine. And they did that. And it was that evening that Jung died.
So interesting. As you talk about this, it makes me want to ask you, how were you drawn to Carl Jung and his work?
I think for me, it was a point in my life when I was desperate. And I think desperation becomes very, very important for us to reach a state of desperation in which we have to reach out to undeveloped parts of our personality. And that happened to me when I was about 49. And my life became meaningless. Although I was working in hospice, I had a job, I had a family, I had wonderful things in my life, but I couldn't appreciate any of it. All of it, my life was a wasteland. And then several things started to break through for me. I was listening to a song by Bob Dylan, singing Mr. Tambourine Man, and I just broke down because I suddenly realized what he was singing about. And I had heard that song a million times and didn't understand it until that moment. But I was getting more experiences like that, where I would something would hit me and it would break through this malaise that I was in. And I end up reading an end of life book by James Hillman called The Force of Character. And that was all about end of life. That was about aging. That was about everything I was working with at that time, only from a very Jungian perspective. And I said, this makes sense to me. And it sparked something in me that I think I would call what Jung called the religious function. This movement towards meaning and purpose. And so from Hillman, I went to Jung and found out that there was a training program at the Jung Institute in Chicago back in the early 2000s, started by Gus Swick and Jane Camerling. And I got accepted into that, and I did that 2-year program. And then I needed more, and I became a psychiatric nurse practitioner. That took 3 years. And after that, was accepted into the analyst training program, and then I did that. So this journey has been going on for like a long time.
Well, that is, first of all, it's an inspiring story that, you broke through melees. And I think that that's probably resonant for a lot of people right now. We live in a time of uncertainty. And so I'm going to ask you another hard question. I realize I've been asking you a lot of big questions.
They're good questions.
Thank you. I wonder what would be the one thing if somebody wanted to feel like they could break through the fog of uncertainty right now that we're living in with the pandemic and an economy that's rocking, and people are losing their work identities and their sense of place and a sense of purpose. What's the one Jungian ideal that they could hang on to that would help them? I'm asking for I guess it's a simple question, really. Maybe it's oversimplified, but what would be the life ring that you would throw them?
Well, I think, the most important thing, which you can't really tell somebody in that state, so you have to be with them in the state that they're in. That is really the pathway to the darkest places within us. And for a therapist to be of any help to a patient. But if I think conceptually, to answer the question, I think we have to move from our experience of life as victims, being victimized by life, which is very tempting for all of us, right? Particularly at this time when things are taken away from us and we're isolated, and it's very tempting to feel victimized. To move to a place in one's life of authorship, that we're really and can be an author of our life, which sounds very inflated, very paradoxical, that somebody would experience, would be the author of this misery, right? But that there was no guarantees that we would come into the world and have everything given to us. And that the darker and austere aspects of life can be just as valuable as the rest of it, and is necessary. And again, telling somebody that when they're in the midst of it is not helpful, but help sitting with them while they're in it. It can probably be the most helpful thing that we could do.
Thank you, Dan. That's a great place to end today. And this has been just marvelous to talk with you.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful opportunity, and I appreciate you doing this.
Oh, my pleasure, believe me.
This podcast is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Share it all you like as long as you maintain the attribution to the speaker, but please do not change it or sell it. If you like this episode, tell your friends about us or leave us a review on iTunes. For more information about classes, training programs, videos, audio, this podcast, or to find a Jungian analyst near you, visit our website, www.jungchicago.org. Thank you to the 2020 donors who gave at the supporting member level and above: Barbara Anand, Usha and Ashok Beatty, Jackie K. Bryan, Eric Cooper, Judith Cooper, Kevin Davis, George J. Didier, James Fidelibus, John Korolewski, Marty Manning, Diane Sherwood, Deborah P. Stutzman, Deborah Tobin, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, Gerald Weiner, Karen West, and James Taylor, and Ellen Young. And thank you to everybody else who gave at that level but wishes to remain anonymous.